Hello, and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we talk about all sorts of great things in the open source community and have a little fun while we're doing it. I got my I got my coffee, so let's go ahead and get started. So today, my guest is Mordechai Zuber. Say hello, Mordecai.
Hi.
And just as a heads up, Mordecai has a little bit of the internet has to go very, very far to for him
A
to
tad.
be able to see. Do you want to just talk about yourself a little bit?
Um, I'm American born. I live in Israel now. Been a developer for about 6 years. Yeah, about six, almost 7 years now. I work for an educational nonprofit based out of New York, focused on Jewish education.
That's awesome. So, I have just a general question about open source and what your experience has been, right? So, do you remember the first time that open source appeared to you? Like, when was the first time you truly saw something, realized that it was built, for free, also built for community enablement? It doesn't have to
The
be
the
software either. It could be anything.
the first exposure to open source I had was with 24 pull requests, which was a program that ran for a few years in December, trying to encourage people to make pull requests to open source. Um, One a day leading up to the holiday season, and so I was a fresh developer when I first came across it, and I was looking for something easy. I ended up on a project called Forkability, which had the goal of it was a meta project basically. You gave it a the URL of a repository, and it would tell you if it's how how ready it is to accept contributors. So it was a tool both for people who are potential contributors who would want to give something into the project. They can come in and look and say, okay, this project has a README, it has a code of conduct, it has an active maintainer. It's something I want to get involved in. It's the same, on the flip side of the coin, it's something a maintainer could run against their own repositories to see, okay, this is where I can improve my repositories and encourage other people to contribute to my projects. And so I made a few small pull requests to that project, and then I ended up actually becoming one of the maintainers of it. Yeah, and so that big, the other project I maintain that actually has users is a little watch tool for npm scripts. That also was something that I used it on a project. I contributed a fix or two, and the original owner said that he's not using Node anymore. So anyone's around that's interested, speak up. So I spoke up. It was something I was using, something I had an interest in. Um, and that's still around. It just has a small issue of burnout because it was having a lot of trouble on Macs, which I don't have access to, and it was just like it became this somewhat of a vicious cycle of I'd get a pull request and I try and make a change and be chasing after people to trying to find someone who could help me test it, and oh, it didn't work in this edge case, didn't work in that edge case. Um, so that's the other big project I've been involved in.
That's awesome. So, I think one of the things that I see over all of these people, all these interviews that I've had where I talk to people about open source, they have like a defining moment where they're like, "Hey, this is something really, really cool, and why can't I be a part of it?" Uh, and did you remember like was it when you were working on that first project you mentioned, or was it something even earlier? Like, for instance, like some folks they talk to me about, they were always tinkerers. So one of the things they like to do is they like to take apart stuff, put stuff back together, just to understand how it works. And I feel like a lot of folks in the community have similar personality traits, somewhat similar in that vein.
I'm not sure how much I would of a tinkerer I would call myself. Of how much I would. I do enjoy figuring out why things work, how things work, and in general, in coding, I find it easier and enjoy more taking a piece of legacy code, figuring out what it does, and how to improve it. I think one of the biggest points when I was working with open source was when I got involved with the octokit.net project, which is a wrapper for the GitHub API in C Sharp, and realizing that I could be involved in it. I could be involved in something making other developers' life much easier. I could be involved in something that enables me to write tools for myself to get things done.
No, that's pretty spot on. And for anybody who's not aware, like the OctaKit, their entire organization, they do JavaScript implementation, Sharp, like they do awesome work. I use them a lot for a lot of the open source projects that I do because I seem to care about GitHub interactivity a lot. I start to look at things, so hats off to the OctoKit folks. So what do you so kind of talked a little bit about what your current role. Maybe talk a little bit about what your roles been and how they got to where.
Um, so I started out just as I guess we call it an individual contributor working on a team. We had dedicated front end people. I came on as someone who was somewhat of a jack of all trades. I have a little bit of experience in databases. My main experience is in server side, and then I dabbled in front end. So I guess what we call full stack developer.
And
Right. So like if you ask me anything about like okay, anything networking, I don't really know what's going on.
sure.
And there was a time when I was more focused on the front end, so I was actually writing CSS. I haven't written CSS in a long time, and it's good.
Yeah.
It's better that way. Um, and then we're in a small team, and as some senior members moved on to other projects, the last 6 months to a year, I've been slowly moving into a more um, program manager position. It's not really managing. It's more, okay, this is a project. Figure out the design. Figure out what you want to accomplish, how you want to accomplish, and get down into the gritty details of the implementation and make sure it happens.
That's awesome. So one of the things that you mentioned, and I kind of cut you off, and I apologize, but you kind of mentioned like this concept of a stack developer, right? Um, obviously everybody kind of has their areas of interest. Like for me, I've always been a C sharp developer. I've been forced to learn the way of front development not very well. But so do you have a preference working on stuff? Like you mentioned you started out in server side and doing database stuff. Um, but like when you're doing something or starting up something from scratch just as a concept or I just want to see if I can make this happen. Like what do you usually start out with?
Up until about 3 or 4 months ago, the answer would have always been C sharp. As I'm getting more exposed, I've been using TypeScript for 4 or 5 years already. As TypeScript improves, as I get more experience with the type system and the flexibility of it, when I'm prototyping something, these days I'll reach for something like TypeScript. Oftentimes with an eye to, if it's pure server side, I will have an eye out to move it over to C sharp once things start getting a little bit more solidified. But for when API or the design is at a very fluid level, I find it much easier to work with something a little bit more dynamic than C sharp.
That's great. So I'm gonna lead to this question. Like, so you mentioned like if prefer to do like you start prefer to start like in the TypeScript area, because you can kind of get started very quick. What are your thoughts about Blazor, especially WebAssembly Blazor, right? Like you mentioned that you love C sharp, and unfortunately C sharp, and it's all done on the server side. Like you some of the great UI experience. Blazor fixes that to some extent, right? So what are your thoughts about
I'll be honest, I haven't followed the project much since build 20, let's say 2019.
that? Okay,
So that's the year and a half was the last time I really paid much attention because I don't have enough say in my department to say that we should be
sure.
using full C sharp on the full stack. Um, it's something that if I was building a project on my own, I would most probably use. If I was doing a full stack project on my own and stuff, it's something I would most probably use because I can have a high appreciation for having something typed all the way through. I've dealt with enough. We have a few projects where the actual front end is written in PHP and then it has a little bit of JavaScript mixed in to call out to C Sharp API that maybe speaks to some other parts, and it's a mess. And we have no idea what one section is, what one place is doing with the other.
Yeah, it from my experience in doing developer, like you always end up with these situations. Folks are like each team kind of has like their we use this programming language, we use this particular setup, and then when you try to like, because obviously like no software is in silo at the end of the day, eventually you have to do integrations between different teams, and it is always very interesting because if front end team that's writing JavaScript is having to interact with some team that writes like a middle layer, like using PHP, and then APIs that are in C sharp, it becomes very challenging, right? I think the idea of doing whether it's Blazor or whether that's having Node all the way through, like there's definitely some huge gains, like not having to slow down to do integration.
For sure. I mean, we have some smaller projects that were Node the whole way through, Node, TypeScript, and Vue the whole way through, and it was much easier. Um, for heavy duty server side, I would still want to stick with C sharp though. So if I can, I need something strong typed sitting in between the server and the front end. On our main project, we're using GraphQL. So we're not using anything that we're handwriting the SDL, the definitions inside GraphQL, which is I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you're starting a project from scratch. If you're starting a project from scratch, make sure you're using try and find tooling that lets you generate the typings, does most of the hard work for you. I mean, even when you're handwriting the SDL, it still makes it much easier to understand. Oh, okay, this is what I'm doing. And going back to what I mentioned about starting a project with TypeScript, that's the big advantage to me is you can write out the types. And when you're planning the project, if you plan from the types, it can help guide your project to where you want to go, to guide you to an actual implementation and help you
Yeah,
on get into the domain and understand what you're trying to accomplish.
no, I totally agree, right? And I think one of the things that's really kind of stick with the tool that you like, and if you're forced to use a different tool, like um, so
Yeah.
one of the things that's I'm very curious about, like, so you mentioned that your team, if you had a choice, right, you would use potentially like C sharp all the way through, have you, right? So do you have any insight into what? It doesn't have to be for your current project, but for any project, right? It could just be, something that you've worked on. Like, what ends up going into the process for building applications, right? Curious what your thoughts are, because is it a lot of people tell me it's literally like, oh, we have developers that know Angular, so we're gonna build a front end with Angular. Like, oh, we have C sharp developers, back end with C sharp. Is that typically how you see it, or is there a bit more thought into it?
I think it's definitely has a lot of weight of what do the developers on hand know. But I wouldn't say, okay, so if I only know C sharp, I'm gonna stick with C sharp. There's almost every language has a similar language in a parallel family. So I know C sharp, but if most of the other members on the team for this new project know JavaScript, let's meet in a middle ground of TypeScript, which again, TypeScript I wouldn't call TypeScript and C# are not that related. At the end of the day, they have very different type systems, but it's similar enough that I can take a lot of the concepts that I know from C# and apply them in TypeScript.
Yeah, very much so. Like it's very easy to um I guess to realize that the wrote TypeScript also are not the person who came up with the original concepts and did a lot of the initial proofing of TypeScript actually the same person sharp, right? There's
Yeah,
definitely you look at like you could just look at an implementation of it's like a class with a couple of functions and class with a couple of functions sharp and you'll notice there's a lot shared kind of readability and just general like oh okay this is how you do it here this is how you do it and I think that's why a lot of people they like TypeScript if they've been C# developers, right? I think a lot of
yeah,
people looking at just a bunch of JavaScript code like vanilla JavaScript very anxious, especially if they come from a server side developer background. TypeScript definitely helps, right? Like there's that, oh, I kind of can read what's going on here. Um, and the fact that it takes
right,
that code and it transpiles it down to JavaScript.
yeah.
I did have a
I mean,
question, but did you want?
yeah, I didn't fully answer your question of
Oh,
how
sure.
I see what to pick. So you do want to pay attention to what your developers know, but at the end of the day, there are domains where specific languages do a better job of getting done what you need. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're building a standard line of business application that's and I'm not making light of anyone's hard work, but what I'm doing, it can't be done in Excel. I mean, not without
Sure.
the same amount of work that we're doing in building an actual application. But it's not a domain that I see that it would make a major difference what language you're using. So then
Sure.
you use whatever you're comfortable with. And even for the mobile apps, okay, so we have a few mobile apps. So, but nowadays you have enough options of things like React Native. Vue has something else like happens to most of our front ends are in Vue, but for mobile we're using React Native because when we started the projects, that was the most well baked option out there.
Yeah, there's definitely something to that, especially with enterprise development. Like, hey, I need to build an app X. Okay, what is like the de facto standard of building apps of that similar nature, right? And you make a pretty clear point, right? Like if you're building line of business data types apps, whether web, even client, you like they're very similar, right? Like it's funny because I've written a lot of line of business apps in my career, and it's always like okay, I feel like the projects are always structured the same way. Like I have like two or three
Right.
projects, and like all the folders are very similarly named. So even to the fact that if you go to look at my GitHub repositories, like structure is very similar. Like even the naming of the folders and naming of classes, it's just because like if you're building an app that hits a database and puts stuff on a front end, the process is very similar to the repository. Maybe the logic change.
Right.
So I want to talk a little bit about like you mentioned about that you've maintained and been a contributor to open source projects. So kind of talk to me through about how that experience is as a maintainer, right? Like one of the things when you and I were originally talking about you coming on stream show, you kind of talked about burnout a little, right? Where it's like you mentioned, oh, I don't really do a ton of open source contribution anymore because I got tired of it, right? I'd like to kind of get your thoughts about like just the general feeling of being an open source maintainer, right? As somebody who's been one to a small extent myself, like I've had my challenge that
No, I think the biggest challenge is dealing with. I mean, part of it has to do with the type of project I ended up with. like some of my side projects that I threw out there, and I've had some very interesting drive-by contributions from someone who was looking to build up his portfolios. He wanted to make a few pull requests, and I said sure. And like, so at that point in my life, I was doing a lot of traveling for work, so I was happy to talk with, like, even had a call with him, had a Google Hangouts call with him one day on the way home from work to walk him through some part of the code. I've had people reach out to me on Twitter. Oh, hi, we're students from somewhere halfway across the world, and we decided to pick your project as part of our coursework on open source, where we're supposed to practice pull requests and things like that. Do you mind if we go through your code? Do you mind suggesting an area for us to work on? But for the actual projects that we work on, that I maintain, I happen to end up with a tool that's very hard to test. And, you know, even manual testing is very hard because it's a file watcher. And there's idiosyncrasies between every operating system, between every little configuration. And, at some point it was like, I have a ton of work, and I'm trying to also have a life. I'm married, I have a kid. There's the whole fun and games of a work-life balance. And to just test out someone's change, it takes time.
Yeah.
And I, also crossed multiple different projects. I had people come in and, I have a little project that I made when I was in school. We had a hackathon in school, and we built a little finance management system. And someone came and said, "Oh, you should be using CQRS. Here, I'll make a pull request to set that up for you." And I had never heard of CQRS before, and he didn't even really put in a link to any sort of explanation of what it was in the document, of what it was in the pull request, until I started. Excuse me. Sorry. Um, it was just like, oh, here's this concept. Go search the abbreviations. I asked him, okay, and so then he started in some issues. He started sending me a little bit of material, what's going on. But at the end of the day, it was a project that I wasn't actively involved in, and to go review thousands of lines of code that were
Yeah.
changed, I was just like, yeah, I don't think this is gonna get in.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like you somebody comes across an open source project and they immediately think, "Oh, this could be done a better way." Right? The funny thing is like, okay, let's decide to do this enormous pull request, knowing that it's one main, like there's some challenges in that, right? Like
Yeah,
things one of the things that I tell folks, that if they want to contribute to any of my stuff is like, look, you gotta show me your test result. I do not want to test any. I have a hard enough time testing my own code. I'm gonna test your code.
right.
Um, and that's helped. It's also turned some people away, which I think I'm good or bad. Somebody's not willing to show me that their stuff works. Investment. Um, but one of the things as well I think is interesting in general is that in open source particularly, you have this concept of, at least that I see, you have this concept of being like, oh, I see something, like I would love it if it did this particular thing to fit my exact need, right? Which is really challenging from a maintainer perspective. You definitely don't want to be one person project's goal. So yeah. Like in your situation, like I don't know anything about CQRS either. So like my first response was, well, okay, can you tell me why? And the person can't justify it, like it's just an ignore button. Um,
Right.
yeah. Um, so is that kind of what led to your burnout? Is just like a lot of like people wanting to contribute in self-serving ways, and you having to do a lot of work in the process of managing it, and it's just like this isn't.
I don't think that particular
Sure.
was, I mean, was the main factor. It was more just the slow buildup of I took over a project. I want to maintain it. I want to make it useful, and it's just the slow burn of playing whack-a-mole with different like the main project I think that really burned me out was again this npm watch project because it was just a slow burn of these small hard to debug hard to diagnose issues, and it was like, I mean, people were trying to like, there was a small period of time that people were trying to help, but
Yeah.
it was, when you're dealing with Heisenbugs, it's very hard for, for someone to come in and help,
Yeah.
especially when, you know, there are other solutions.
Oh, for sure. One of the things that I see that people are, it's not as much people, but as like large organizations, Google or Microsoft, or even some larger like third parties, like they'll have like a test, like Chocolatey does. Like they have a test environment where they have like a VM or a suite of VMs that are running that basically do all the testing for your code, right? Like I've seen
Yeah.
that a few times, and I'm like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like I love that idea. However, like somebody to do it for their XYZ projects really. But it's one of those things where I was thinking the other day, if there was and if anybody on the chat or anybody watching this later, knows of frameworks that exist to like build out environments that do that on the fly, that'd be very interesting. Like if I'm building for npm, sure, right, like you are, if there was a way for every pull request to like trigger not like tests, because running tests is, but actually like configuring an environment that does a suite of tests, right, in an actual environment, instead of just running some code test, which is valuable, but also like it's not the rule, right? I'd be very curious
Right.
about that. I think Chocolatey does it pretty well, right? Like if you've ever been a maintainer for a Chocolatey package, when you get submit, they basically give you like a build. They spin up some Windows 12 server that they go through the entire Chocolatey process of it, and then they uninstall your app, and if anything doesn't look right at the end of it, um, they say no thanks. It's kind of cool, I think. I think it's pretty
Yeah.
impressive, and yeah. But again, like Mordecai or Isaac having that plugged into one of their open source projects is probably not going to happen. I would love to see if there's frameworks that exist to kind of bootstrap that.
That's something that would definitely be very interesting.
Yeah. Um. So you know, you kind of talked a little bit about what your day, like what your work is, right? So when you were, and also talked about some of the projects that you've done. So when you're looking out there for like, oh, maybe I'm kind of interested in thing, like what do you typically look for, like in an open source project? Like what is a good open?
Um, the, the main thing that I need is documentation. That's the
Sure.
first thing I look for. Even if it's an old project, that bothers me less as long as there's documentation.
Yeah.
Um, because even if it's an old project that therefore has a dependency that needs to be updated as something that's broken, but if it's documented and I know what I'm expecting to happen and I know what I need to do, then I can actually say, okay, worst case scenario, I'll say this seems to be a bug. Maybe I can propose a solution. Even if I can't, I can at least try and start a conversation.
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. That's it's funny because our my friend Scott Addy, who happens to work on the Microsoft ASP.NET Core docs, comes in and someone say documentation. I think it's very, very fair, right? Like as somebody who despises writing documentation, I appreciate, yeah. And I've done a lot, like I've contributed to docs as well. I don't enjoy it as much as others, but I see the intrinsical value there, right? Like your point is spot on. Like if I'm looking through, like occasionally, like I'll go and I'll just Google search and then put GitHub at the end of it, and I'll just look at some GitHub repositories that do that particular thing. And the two things that you mentioned, right? Like, when was the last commit? I look at that first, and then I look to see if they have a wiki. If they don't have a wiki, and if they're like, they haven't had a commit in a few months or even a few years, I'm very much like, okay, close tab. But if they have a wiki, like, I'm immediately like, okay, well, somebody's actually taken some time into making sure people know how this works. It doesn't have to be huge documentation, but like getting started is very, very valuable. A like 3 or 4 lines of sample code to do something. There's a sample project, that's great. One of the things I'm very, very guilty of is like I built the thing, so I know how it all works and everything, and I typically will never document, I'll never write a sample app, um, and probably it's a personality flaw, I guess you could say. But I think that there's definitely some value in making sure, like when you build an open source project and you have people use it, it's like 4 or 5 checkboxes. Writing a really good documentation set is
Right. And I think most people don't have such an easy time writing documentation. Um, I'm not the best at writing documentation either. And for me, even a README that goes through the happy path of the public API is already a good start. So don't necessarily tell me what all the possible exceptions are going to be,
sure.
or these are the errors you should expect. Um, but if you could give me at least a basic rundown of the happy path, that really makes a big difference.
Yeah, most definitely. Like I don't think anybody expects like docs.microsoft.com or Java Docs or whatever for the open source repository, but there's definitely an opportunity to. One of the things that I thought about recently, if I could explain this project to a non-technical, right? Like that would be really valuable. So like
Yeah.
even just talking about what your project really does, like that's like top level. There's a lot of projects that I'll see and I'll be like, okay, what exactly does this do? I'm looking at the name. Name kind of makes sense, but like I have no idea what it is. So I have to drill into code, which sometimes it's fun to look at other people's code. Sometimes it's um especially if you disagree with their programming practices. You have bad programming practices, they don't have. They have vice versa, right?
Right.
I do think that there's something about reading other people's code too, which kind of like tickles me a little bit. I don't know if you feel the same way. Like I'll look at people's code and I'll be like, oh, that's a very interesting. Or if I don't agree with it, I'll be like, that's a terrible. Similar. You judge people by the code they write.
I don't judge people by the code they write. I judge code by how it was written.
Sure, 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 sure.
I
That's a
mean,
better
I
way to say it.
definitely. Sorry.
That's a better way to say it. Yeah. Not gonna
Um,
judge people. You can judge code though.
right. And in general, I find one of the things that made one of the big advantages of open source that I found for my growth as a developer was being able to read other people's code. And even if it's a project that we're not necessarily going to use, but being able to look at code and trying to understand how they implemented it and use similar patterns and practices in my own code is something that's to me is very valuable.
No, I totally agree. Like for instance, I was talking to a friend of mine, and we're working on a project together right now, and he told me, hey, like I committed code to this repo, and I'm okay, cool, I'll take a look. And I messaged him. I said it's funny because just I can look at the code right now, and I know that you like. I feel like everybody has a signature, right? Looks very similar every time, and I think that there's definitely back to my point about project structure and things like that. People write code a very particular way, like, and that never changes. And it was just funny that I've seen enough of this individual person's code that I'm like, yep, I know that person wrote that code. So
Yeah,
it's just very funny how that works, right?
yeah,
Yeah, I think one of the things as well that I think is really interesting about open source in general is um, just the general like I had a conversation um, maybe it was earlier this week about how there are particular echo chambers in open source, right? and just in general in the tech community. And I've been thinking about that a lot over the last couple of days, and I'd like to know what your thoughts on that, right? Like we all kind of sit and hang out in the technologies that we're familiar with. And I'm curious to know like if you see similar things or maybe it's just something that I just think that just pertains to.
There's definitely clicks when it comes to technology. There's
Yeah.
there's no question. I think the issue starts when someone from within an echo chamber, someone from within a group looks at someone else and says, "Oh, but you're not paying any attention to what's happening in our corner, so you have an issue." I think if someone knows a technology, knows a programming language, and it works for them, and they're happy,
Yeah.
don't try showing them why they shouldn't be happy.
Yeah.
So not every echo chamber is a bad thing. I personally, I use on a day-to-day basis. I use at least two programming languages. Um, I enjoy, like, I would love to learn more languages if I had the time to actually invest in using them. Like, yeah, you can do, there's all sorts of websites for learning the basics of programming languages. I started doing a little PHP because we have some PHP on the team, but I never, just using an app, clicking through, okay, here's the syntax, will it run, won't it run, things like that. I don't know PHP.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's very interesting too, right? Like if depending on who you follow on Twitter, especially especially who you follow on Twitter, like one of the things that is really, really, really telling is whose particular, I guess you could say, political or religious affiliation is, right? Like it's very, very. I'd love to know, like when you go and look at like social media or tech, tech blogs or on GitHub, right? Like, do you think that it's a good thing that like we all kind of hang out in the same little area, or is it kind of to what your point? Like, you work on two different programming languages. What are your thoughts about um, like trying to bridge the gap between areas?
Willing to adapt if someone brings you something.
Yeah. So,
Um,
sorry, you were gonna
I'm not
finish
sure if
up.
that exactly answers your question.
I mean, so one of the things that I just noticed is that your audio kind of cut out a little bit. So let's just say that you were correct. I didn't really hear a lot of it.
Sure.
um, so that's the beauty of doing these things on
I
the
would
internet.
let. I think maybe I can summarize a little bit
Yeah,
better. Don't be fanatic,
yeah,
but you don't have to go searching.
sure, that's fair.
If you're comfortable, you are fine. Like I didn't. I've started applying a slightly more functional style to my code that I write, but not because someone came over and tried to convert me to becoming a functional programmer,
Yeah,
but rather because I try and follow various a range of people to see what's going on. I mean, I personally am interested in seeing what's going on, and I'm not. I see the value in functional programming, and the level of functional programming I can accomplish in C# is enough for me. So that I think comes close to happy medium, where I'm staying relatively in my bubble, but I'm open to accepting ideas from outside.
no, and I think that's a really good way to think about it too, right? Like again, like I mentioned, or religious affiliation, right? Like everybody kind of has their like you said clicks. I think one of the big things is that I see it, and the reason why I bring this up is just like as somebody who's the .NET echo chamber, I see a lot of um, really extreme opinions about .NET, and it's always very curious to me. I'm on one side particularly, and I don't really understand the other side, which is I guess is what the whole concept of echo chamber. But occasionally, what I've started to do is go into other areas. Like now, I follow a lot of people that write in the Go. I've always been following a lot of JavaScript folks, but I guess the point of what this conversation I wanted to kind of bring up was like it's very important for you to, in my opinion, to follow as many people that you think are interesting,
Yeah.
right? Um, Even to your point, right? Like you might find out something that uh, you could go and take back to personal development or your technical development or what have you. Kind of hanging out with the same like 50 people probably not ideal. Like one thing, for instance, I've started to do a lot of Python. I did Python development when I was in college, and whatever it was, okay, it was a small project. But like I actually took a solid look at Python, probably starting about a couple weeks ago, and I like it a lot. Um, doesn't mean that I'll
Right.
ever write a. I'll choose Python over C Sharp, probably not, unless a particular situation is appropriate. But now I can easily like, oh, I want to do something that interfaces with an IoT device. Like Python is great for that. C Sharp isn't, but Python is especially great for it.
Right.
So I guess it's very. I guess my whole ramble very important to try to understand and follow the opinions of others because they might teach you.
Right. I agree 100% with that. And I don't think developers need to be a polyglot developer in order to be a good developer.
Yeah.
But it helps if you can recognize patterns in code in a language that you don't write.
Yep. Yeah. It's to that point. Like I tried to learn Go about a year ago, and I'm contemplating getting back into it now. I just had a very hard time when I started to learn it. Tried to learn about a year ago because it's so substantially different than like just the
Yeah.
general constructs of the language. I was having a very hard time wrapping my head around because I'm so used to C Sharp. So
Yeah.
I immediately gave up, and I'm like, you know what, this isn't for me. Whatever. Um, I think I'm gonna try to get back into it because one of those things where it's always good to stretch your mind. Like sitting in something that's easy is kind of boring after a while. So one of those things where even if it's hard and even if you're struggling through it, like doing something very small is very satisfying.
Yeah. And like Go hasn't actually been on my radar, but like I've wanted to go much deeper into TypeScript. I wanted to
Yeah.
go. Python is actually something I was considering for a little bit, but never really got much into it. I wanted to, because I started getting an interest in functional programming, I would love for an opportunity to use a functional programming language. And the paradigm shift is strong enough anyway that I think I would use anything like I considered. I was at, I don't remember what conference I was at. Um, but like I went to a few different talks on Elixir, and I don't remember what I think. Oh, okay, so there was a workshop where they said, okay, we're gonna run through the same basic program in four different functional programming languages.
Oh,
But then so okay, so I sat there for the 2 3 hours. That was the workshop, and put everything, had a VM and installed everything and did the little exercise, and that was it.
yeah.
Because busy with everything else, I don't have a chance to actually invest in it.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's an interesting concept, especially like it's hey, we're gonna do the same exercise and do it in a bunch of different ways, right? Like that's very interesting. Never actually seen that at a conference I've been to, but I'm very curious. Like that might be something. Maybe I'll try to do a workshop on that. Maybe I'll learn.
That's the plan.
Yeah, cool. Well, when we do have conference, I guess you could do it on. Maybe I'll do it on Twitch. Um, so we're coming to the end of our time, And one of the things that I always want to end our conversation with is I like to ask my guests, like, if you could think of one word to describe open source, what would that word be?
Community.
Community. That's very, very common. Like, it's definitely one of those things where, you know, it is strange. It is like most of my very good friends, like I've met the open source community, which is so that's the end of our show. So I want to thank my friend Mordecai for coming on. You can follow him on More Zuber, and that's Twitter and GitHub, right?
More Zuber on Twitter, m-zuber on GitHub.
Okay, awesome. So that will be our episode of Coffee and Open Source. So thank you so much for your time, and everybody take care. Bye bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye bye.